Hello everybody and welcome. In this video, we're going to go over the new EL-IP-MTX-8 channel audio matrix in single chassis mode. So we're going to go over this new hardware. We're going to go over the configuration, the options, and even touch on some design with this new chassis. I'm Larry, Director of Integration over here at Nortech Security and Control. This new chassis is part of a larger suite of products that we will be releasing later on this year. This is a new audio platform that we are bringing to market, and it will retain a lot of those features that you have grown accustomed to with the ES-1616A, and some new features we'll talk about shortly. So first, let's take a look at these three sections. We have the chassis, we have inputs, and we have outputs. This chassis can be used out of the box in single chassis mode. If you want to update that to use audio over IP, you certainly can. And to do that, you need this optional card, and we'll get into that in a future module. This chassis features Ethernet for control, has three 12-volt trigger outputs. This chassis has two LEDs on the front, one for status and one for power. That is a 2U rack height chassis, and it does come with rack gears. It is 80 watts per channel, rated at 8 ohms, and 100 watts per channel into 4 ohms. It is rated for 120 or 240 volt operation. On the input side, we've got two optical toslink inputs, two coaxial inputs, 4 pairs of RCA. Now those can be configured as stereo as they are out of the box, or can be 8 mono inputs, or any combination thereof. It has a 3.5 millimeter stereo doorbell input, and those analog inputs have a plus and minus 6 decibel gain on them. On the output side, we have 8 speaker outputs. We have 4 RCA outputs. Those can be configured as fixed or variable. Any of the outputs can be set to be a left channel, a right channel, a mono channel, or a sub output. 400 milliseconds of lip sync correction per output, plus or minus 12 decibel gain for each output. There's a 5-band EQ, and this particular chassis can go up to 12 zones, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. All right, let's take a look at the business end. Starting in the upper left, that's where we have our Ethernet connection. Now that is a card. This is pre-installed from the factory, but if you wanted to update this chassis to use audio over IP, this is the card that you would replace with the optional card coming out again later on this year. Here we find those 3 12-volt trigger outputs, and these are fairly universal. To turn them on or off, you'll simply create an event map, and that could be, when the chassis turns on, any of the zones, specific zones. So we find that to be pretty flexible in the way that you can use these. Each of these has 100 milliamp outputs. All right, moving over, we have our preamp outputs here. Now, these can be configured independently of each other, or they can be configured as stereo pairs. The use is up to you. Each of them could be configured as a left to right, a mono, or a sub output. And you could also set each one to be either fixed or variable. Over on the input side, here are our 2 optical inputs. These are stereo PCM, 48K and 24-bit compatible. Moving on to our coaxial inputs, they share the same specs. Doorbell in, here's our 3.5 millimeter stereo connection. Now this will identify itself in the configurator as just a regular old source input. This is stereo only. You cannot make this particular input mono. And here we have our RCA inputs. You can see that there is 4 stereo pairs. However, these can be configured to be mono inputs if you would like. And again, it could be a mix. You can have 2 stereo pairs, and you can have 4 mono inputs or any combination thereof. These also have that input gain of plus or minus 6 dBs. And here we find the speaker outputs. So these are 8 individual speaker outputs. They're not tied to a zone permanently, and we're going to get into that in the configuration side. But each of these can be set to left, a right, a mono, or a sub. Well, that completes the overview of the hardware. Next, we're going to get into the configuration. Now, first thing we'll take a look at under the inputs is the analog section. So out of the box, these will work in 2 modes, as I have mentioned, stereo or mono. Out of the box, these are configured for stereo. So if you're using stereo sources, there's nothing more you need to do. You can, however, change these to mono. So you would go to that mode box, select mono, then go to the inputs box and select which input that you want to make mono. Now, when you do that, the other RCA you can use, you have to then right-click and add a new source. Then select mode for mono, and then you'll be able to assign that to that other input. So even if you're setting it to mono, you're not orphaning any inputs. The input gain is plus or minus 6 decibels. So that is, again, used primarily to trim your sources. So when you're going between them, they have a more even sound. If you have a source that's a little low or a little high on the output. The digital inputs, they're pre-configured. There's nothing more that you need to do to them. They're stereo only. There is no input level gain on those either. Now let's move to the output section. So the output section, if you notice here, is located right under the zone. So in the top-down approach, you configure your sources, then you come down to your zones. Immediately under the zones is this node called configuration. So again, that's where you would select first. And note that this chassis is pre-configured for stereo zones. So odds are there'll be at least a few stereo zones. So we try to do, again, as much of the work as we can for you. So pre-defining zones, so out of the box it'll work. Then if you need to modify those zones, you can go ahead and do that. Let's take a look and see what that would look like. Once you're in the configuration node, we're going to go column by column. Now I have changed a couple things here to highlight what you can do. So starting on the left-hand side, this column labeled outputs are the physical outputs that the chassis has. So you see amp 1 through 8. Those are the actual 8 speaker outputs. And preamp 1 through 4, those are the actual preamp outputs. Those don't change. Those are just to let you know which output you're changing. The next column is zone. So this is where you do your zone assignment. So we pre-configured the chassis for 6 zone stereo outputs. However, and in most cases, you can be able to change this to your needs. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in design. You would do that by right-clicking on the zone. And if you look at preamp 1, I have done that there. So I right-clicked and I set preamp 1 to zone 1. So now I have zone 1 has 3 outputs, right? And I think you'll find that there'll be situations where you might have 1 output. A few other things you could do here. One, you can create a new zone. So when you right-click, if you have more than 6 zones, remember this chassis can be configured up to 12 zones, single output on each. Since we're predefining the zones out of the box, for stereo zones, 6 zones, if you need another zone, instead of having to jump out, go to zones, right-click, add new, come back, then set it, right from this menu, you can right-click, add the new zone. You can also rename all the zones, so you don't have to remember what outputs you're setting up. So the right-click function will let you assign the zone, create a new zone, or rename a zone. There's also a new multi-select functionality. So if you had a bunch of different outputs that you wanted to assign, instead of doing them one at a time, you can multi-select those, right-click, and assign them all at the same time. All right, the next column is named type. So we need to know what kind of output it is. So you have to have an assignment here, and it's left, right, mono, or sub. Now the sub is crossed over at 100 Hertz. The mono option is really some stereo or blended stereo. And that's just taking both channels and putting them, adding them together. This next column is called impedance. And by default, it is set to 4 ohms. Now, you should set this to whatever your actual output is. So if you're using 8 ohm speakers and you have one speaker on the output, then you would right click and change this to 8 ohms. Just make sure to change this to whatever is physically connected to those outputs. Now, a common scenario is to connect 2 8 ohm speakers to one output, getting your 4 ohms. This next column is called line level. So this is only for the preamp, and this is set to variable by default. But if you needed a fixed output here, you would just right click and set that. Common uses for that are when you're connecting an output to an AVR, for example. The next column is gain. So each output has plus or minus 12 decibel of gain to play with. Now the idea with this is you can use this to trim that room. Think of it as a balance, but we don't call it balance because a balance indicates that there's a left and a right. And in a lot of cases, you might not have a left and a right. You might have 2 monos, you might have 3 speakers. There's a whole bunch of different scenarios that you might have. So this gives you a chance to really trim those levels in for that particular room. Lip sync delay. This will give you an option to set a lip sync delay on each output up to 400 milliseconds in 10 millisecond increments. Once you've completed the output configuration, the chassis should be pretty well set up to use. The next part is going over the actual zone options. So some typical zone options that we have that we've seen in the past, max volume, on volume max, and on volume minimum. So let's take a look at these. Max volume is the option to set a cap for the volume for that particular zone. And because it's zone-based, it would affect any outputs associated with that zone. So if I wanted to cap the volume in a kid's bedroom, for example, I can drop that max volume down to 80. The next two have to do with zone turn-on. Instead of doing one option where we can set the zone turn-on to a specific volume, we do a range. A max and a minimum make up that range. The default for on-volume maximum is 90. The default for on volume minimum is 10. And here I have changed those. So my volume minimum is 20, my max is 60. So that is my range. So on turn on, when a zone turns on from off, it will try to retain its last known volume. So if its last known volume was between 20 and 60, it'll turn on at that level. However, if the last known volume was either below 20 or higher than 60, it's going to make sure and change that volume to come on within that range. So if it was below 20, it'll turn on to 20. If it was higher than 60, it'll turn on at 60. There is one more setting, and that is an enable or disable for the built-in settings page. In the built-in settings page, there is a 5-band EQ. Now this is really great for being able to set up the sound for the room. Now you can disable this if you want to, and then create your own settings page. Or you could just leave the built-in settings enabled where the end user can have access to the EQ curve. The reset will just reset that curve back to flat, so 0 across those 5 bands. Loudness is a shelving effect for the low frequencies at low volume. So if you enable loudness, basically the bass response will be enhanced again at lower volume, and as you ramp up the volume, that extra low end bump will tailor off. And do not disturb. So do not disturb will prevent any doorbell or paging break-ins to happen over the speakers. Let's go over a couple of the options in the chassis. So these do use the Elan Discovery, Auto Discover, Auto Configure. So out of the box, the Ethernet is set to DHCP. Just plug that in. Go to the configurator, go to Discovery, and it should pop up there with an install button. If we take a look at the front LEDs, again, there are two, one status, one power. Now these are tri-colored LEDs, and between all the color combinations between the two LEDs, we can tell a lot of things. We can indicate a lot of things. So here is a chart of what that will tell us. Now, you don't have to memorize this. This is going to be in the integration note, so you will have full reference to this chart. Next, let's go over a couple of the other chassis options. So we're going to start right here with the configure network. Now that is how you set a static IP address. Again, these are DHCP out of the box. After you import the chassis, you can then go ahead and set a static IP address. You click that box, configure network, enter the IP address, and don't worry if you mess up. To the right of the Ethernet jack, there is a small pinhole. If you press and release the button in there, that will reset the NIC card back to DHCP. Next is low power mode. So this is for ERP compliance, and out of the box, these come with low power mode set to yes. However, when you import the chassis for the first time, we automatically set this to no. And that's really where you want it to be for a day-to-day operation. Low power mode set to no. If you did want to use this low power mode, then you can go ahead and drop this box on and select yes. However, when you're using low power mode, the chassis will take about 15 to 20 seconds to turn on when you turn the zone on. It'll also be too slow to use doorbell. So by the time the doorbell has played, the chassis will just be outputting volume. This drop-down box will enable you to take this project and then update it or upgrade it to an audio over IP setup. The idea here is that you can go ahead and install one of these chassis in single chassis mode, and if you ever need to update to audio over IP, you can go ahead and do that without having to reprogram anything. So you'll be able to drop this box down, convert the project over, and keep going without needing to reprogram. Write configuration. Unlike the S1616A, in normal configuration, this is not necessary. We will write the changes as you're making them. However, if the chassis is asleep, unplugged, disconnected from the network, for any reason it's not receiving those changes, we give you this button here so you can always sync the chassis with what is in the configurator for programming. Firmware update. This box can get its updates via the Ethernet. Now, just like surveillance, we will tell you when there is a firmware update available by indicating it in the status bar. Then you can go ahead and press this button and you will have indication that the firmware is updating. It takes about 3 to 5 minutes. And after that, the chassis MCU version should change to reflect on its reboot. And factory reset. Couple event maps that are capable with this unit. The first is auto detecting audio. So you can see that you're able to write an event map based upon audio detection. Under that, you can see that we have the standard zone-based events. So when a source is selected, unselected, changed, turned on, turned off, those sorts of things. Now in commands, the first one we have is the trigger commands, right? So you're able to trigger those outputs on or off. And then we've got the standard zone-based commands. So increase volume, decrease, mute, select source, turn on, turn off, those sorts of things. And last but not least, we want to talk about mute within the zone. If the zone is muted and you ramp the volume up, we will unmute that automatically for you. If the zone is muted when you turn it off, the next time you turn it on, it will be unmuted. So when you turn a zone on, you should always hear music. Now, if the zone is muted and a doorbell or page comes through, we will unmute the zone, let that come through, then remute the zone after. Now, if you don't want to hear doorbell or page, there's a function for that, and that's do not disturb. The regular mute will not stop a doorbell or page from coming through. And also, we will keep the zone muted on a volume down. So if you mute the zone and then you ramp the volume down, we will keep that mute in place until you unmute it or ramp up the volume back up. Well, that's going to take care of the configuration section. The next section we want to talk about is design. So this chassis has a few unique properties to it, and we find that going over these will help with some designing of projects. So the first thing we want to look at is the zone configurations, right? So again, out of the box, this comes with 6 pre-configured zones. However, the chassis is capable of going up to 12 zones. Now, to get there, we have 8 speaker outputs and 4 preamp outputs. 8 plus 4 is 12. Now, we can set each output to its own zone. So 12 zones of one output. And anything in between. So we got to start thinking of outputs not as zones. So let's take a look at some sample zone types. So the basic zone, 2 speakers left and right, that's going to require 2 outputs, right? Now, a lot of the times when you're doing a project, you might have kitchens, hallways, even outdoor speakers. A lot of these do not require and shouldn't have a left and a right. So by doing a mono output, you can save yourself on an output. So let's take a look at the next zone type, and that's a mono zone. And again, this chassis is 4 ohm stable. So you can put 2 8 ohm speakers on one output. And in case you have 2 kitchen speakers, there really is no left and right in the kitchen. So you can use 2 speakers, 1 output, set it to mono, and that's really just a blended stereo output. And that's only going to take 1 output. So there is going to be a bunch of zones like this for most projects. And that's really how you start to expand to use more than 4 left and right zones, for example. Other zone types that are pretty common is one utilizing a sub on the preamp output. So 2 speakers, you might have a left and right plus a sub. So that would be a 3 output. Using that preamp output in conjunction with speaker outputs to get that sub output. You can also do large zones. Instead of having to go to an external amp, and you can absolutely do that. But you could have 4 plus speakers, right? So since each output can handle 2 speakers, 2 8 ohm speakers, if you have 4 speakers, instead of connecting each one to its own individual output, which again, you still can do, you can put 2 of those speakers on one and 2 on another, and you can use 2 outputs to get those 4 speakers. And again, you can have technically 16 speakers all on one zone if you wanted to. Mixed zone outputs, again, combining speaker outputs and preamp outputs. You could use the preamp outputs for its own zone using an external amplifier. Here's a visual of what that would look like. In this particular application, we have 6 zones and we have 11 speakers plus the whatever the landscape amplifier is driving there. And here's a pretty healthy mix of zones. Let's take a look at zone 3. So that's a single speaker. And in a lot of cases, you'll find either there's a dual voice coil speaker that's already there, or if this is new construction, you don't really need to use a dual voice coil speaker. You can use a regular speaker, one connection back to one output. And if it is a dual voice coil speaker, you can take both the left and the right connections there and still put them under the same output. There's no need to take 2 outputs for that. We have a mix of 4 speaker zone, we have a mono zone, we have a left to right plus a sub zone. So pretty healthy mix of different zones. And is there room to expand? There sure is. We still have 1 unused preamp output. We could use that to an external amplifier. We can convert one of these speakers over to a mono zone and get another output there. And don't forget, we're going to be able to take out that LAN card and insert an audio over IP card, and then we'll be able to expand to multiple chassis. So there's always room for expansion here. Well, that takes us through the new 8-channel MTX chassis, from hardware overview, the configuration, design. Please reference the integration note, the 8.4 release notes that support this chassis, and you can always contact your sales and technical representatives. Thank you, everyone.